Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is actually going to be my updated Game Week 1 draft, and I'm choosing to make an updated draft just simply because of the Gabriel Jesus injury. It's completely changed the way I am now looking at my Game Week 1 draft. What we got in terms of Mikel Arteta confirming his injury is that he will be out for multiple weeks, and that's going to mean that Jesus will not find his way towards Game Week 1. We do get a fortunate match where we get to see City versus Arsenal in the Community Shield. That should give us a little bit of insight in terms of what can we see and what can we expect from this Arsenal team from a formation point of view, from a tactical point of view with Arteta, with Jesus out. I'm expecting that Nketiah will actually find his way back into the lineup, but I will talk about my concerns with some of the Arsenal players and their minutes when I talk about my midfield and potentially even my forwards. As far as the defense, so we just start with there. I'm going to be spending more money on the defense, and you can see that because I'm simply moving away from Onana and going into Ederson. I've actually heard news that Stones might be injured, so I am actually open to the idea of actually maybe moving away from someone like Onana, going for Ederson instead, and then switching Stones into someone like Shaw. In the meantime, though, I'm completely okay and comfortable with going with double city defense, so I will be going towards Ederson and also Ruben Diaz for the time being, just expecting that Stones will be dealing with this injury situation. And then Gabriel, I've actually sort of reopened my mind in terms of whether he is actually the most nailed Arsenal defender. I'm actually starting to think the most nailed defender is going to be Saliba. Now, Saliba has less expected goals per 90, so that's actually going to be worse than Gabriel, obviously. We expect that Gabriel is the better set-piece threat. It's something that we've seen already in the previous season, but I am liking the idea that William Saliba is the most nailed player in this team, so maybe I'm actually a little bit more open to the idea of starting with Saliba this season. However, for now, I'm going to stick with Gabriel, just believing the fact that he will continue to be a huge set-piece threat, and we've already seen that at least for 2 years in the Premier League. As far as Estupiñán, he's someone that I'm not going to shift off of. For me, he's absolutely nailed, unless, of course, he's suffering from an injury. And I don't really think there's too much to discuss from him. He simply has really great fixtures to start, and you can always move him away to someone else in this 5.0 bracket. We have access to Kanate. We have access to Shar. These are all players that we could look at. We could even downgrade in the future to a 4.5, just because some of the 4.5 defenders this year are playing for such elite teams in terms of Villa and Newcastle, even, for example, Chelsea. As far as the midfield, though, I will be going for Mbeumo, Rashford, Fernandes, Saka, and Odegaard. Starting with Mbeumo, he still remains, to me, my favorite 6.5 mid. I've always retained that opinion. I'm very close now in terms of my thinking between Mitoma and Eze, but for me, Mbeumo is still the best option so far. He is someone that we already have confirmed, or reconfirmed rather, is on penalties. Now, Wissa wasn't on the pitch in the preseason, but as I explained previously, he was already on the pitch when Mbeumo took a penalty last season. So we really can't expect for Wissa to have penalties. And as a result, I also think with someone like Sade coming into this Brentford team, he could take more minutes away from a central role, away from someone like Wissa, as opposed to Mbeumo, who I think is going to be absolutely nailed. As far as Rashford and Bruno, no real changes there. Of course, you're going to have to look at what Rasmus Højlund will do when he actually joins this United team. I think Rashford will simply just play within the left wing position. We know and we expect him to be a better player when he's a left forward. And I do think he's more than capable of, once again, having a fantastic FPL season out on the wing. So that is kind of my initial expectation with Rashford if Højlund finds his way towards the starting 11 of United. We've seen a bit of Sancho in the preseason playing false 9. I don't really think that will hold up too much into the early part of the season. I'm definitely not tempted by Sancho, if that makes any sense. And so Rashford and Fernandes make the most sense for me. Basically, the highest amount of XG per 90 outside of any options that have double digits in their pricing. So outside of De Bruyne and Salah, these are your two best options for expected goals per 90 in Rashford and then expected assists per 90 in Bruno Fernandes. And it's an interesting one here because I think you can see that I've clearly strengthened once again my midfield. So therefore my defense and midfield have taken up a huge chunk of my budget. Moving away from players like Jesus means that I have the capacity to spend, and I've decided to spend that sort of money on Odegaard. Now, I like the idea of still going with Eze. I think my friend Mayer, for example, if you actually have a look at the guest draft, which I think is going to be above, you can see that, of course, you can go with the structure where you go with the 2-6-1-5 mids once again. You can go for Eze, you can go for Mbeumo, even Mitoma, who I still think is a fabulous option. However, the idea of going for Odegaard is simply, with Jesus out, who is actually going to get still the best minutes for Arsenal? And I think it's going to be Odegaard, right? At that point, it's sort of like a process of elimination. Jesus is gone. He's someone who I would have expected to be quite nailed, or at least playing at least 80 minutes a game. Now he's no longer a reasonable pick from this Arsenal team. Why not spend that sort of money in someone like Odegaard? And it goes back to the question that I think a lot of people are posing, which is, okay, of course, Martinelli did great last season with slightly less minutes. what's the reason for him to not be in our teams? And the reason why I prefer Odegaard is simply the strength of minutes. That even contributes to things like bonus points and things like that. Yes, you could argue that Martinelli was a better finisher than Odegaard, although I don't think that's necessarily the case. Odegaard actually was the biggest overperformer in finishing, with exception to Kane last season. But the big thing that Martinelli also suffers from, I would say, is with this Jesus injury, I'm kind of reminded of last season when he was playing alongside Nketiah. I don't think the relationship was that particularly good. Now, by contrast, I think Martinelli and Trossard was a fantastic relationship, and we've also seen that Martinelli and Jesus too. This is also a small sample size as well. I think Martinelli and Jesus have only really played 10 odd games last season, and unfortunately, of course, you really want at least maybe 15 to 20 games worth of sample size before you can really make conclusions, but that's my early assessment. And I don't think Martinelli is going to get that many additional minutes because of the Jesus injury. You have to remind yourself that someone like Trossard can actually play three positions. He can play left center mid, left wing, and striker. Martinelli only really a sort of center forward striker role and left wing. So that's two positions where he can conceivably play. And I'm still expecting for Odegaard to be a 90-minute player. Nothing should change there. And for that reason, I just prefer Odegaard because he was pretty much able to match both Saka and Martinelli, if not exceed them at times. And there's no reason to say that Odegaard's not a good pick, and I'm just not going to have concerns over his minutes and potential benchings, which I think is still capable of happening to Martinelli, but potentially not as aggressively as some people have argued for. So that's kind of why I'm going for this midfield. I think it's very safe, very solid. One thing I'd like to look at as we go across to the rest of the season is, does Saka retain penalties? We're already starting to see some very, very poor penalty taking. Ollie Watkins, for example, missing another penalty in his preseason game. Those are questions to be asked, right? Because that directly impacts, the strength of someone like Saka as a pick. Maybe we can move away from him, but because we still think he's on penalties, I'm not touching Saka. As far as the forwards, this is probably going to be the most controversial part of the draft. I'm going for Haaland and João Pedro. And you might be questioning, why am I going for João Pedro, someone who I haven't really been championing for in my previous drafts? I think the biggest thing is there has been a change in news and in terms of communication with some of the Brighton attacking roles. The biggest thing is that Undav is actually set to go off on loan to another Bundesliga team. So that's going to free up some minutes in terms of depth at the striker position, but also the 10 position. So if you actually look back to Brighton's sort of performance match reports last season and the sort of positions that Undav actually played, he did actually fill in a lot of minutes as the attacking mid. And yes, even though Lallana's back and Enciso can play there, I think the biggest thing about João Pedro that sort of differentiates from some of the other Brighton forwards, like a Welbeck, like a Ferguson, is that he can still play that 10 position quite comfortably. And there is a small, I would say 5 to 10% chance that he really could be the penalty taker for this team. We also have no absolute certainty that I would say Gross is 100% nailed for this team. So that's a huge bonus to say maybe João Pedro could actually be the future penalty taker for Brighton. But the biggest thing about João Pedro in this draft is that he's actually not set here in this draft to be part of a 3-5-2 template. He's actually just plugging in a hole for me versus Luton Town at home for game week 1. And then this draft actually shifts towards a 4-5-1. So the idea going forward with this draft is that after using João Pedro for a fantastic game week 1, he just becomes someone who is a security clause. So if Erling Haaland gets injured in a 4-5-1 template, I still can probably fall back on João Pedro's very, very limited minutes if he's not a starter, but I do actually think he's going to be a starter. So at least he's going to be a security blanket if Haaland is, let's say, injured, because 4-5-1 can become an illegal formation, right? If I have two 4.5 forwards, what will happen if Erling Haaland is injured is that I can't actually bring in an auto sub from a different position. Both my 4.5 forwards have to take precedence and they have to find themselves in this draft because you have to field one minimum forward. However, if I have João Pedro on the bench at most time, then I can just simply call upon him. And the next time I really need João Pedro, if you think about game weeks 1 to 8 for Brighton, is probably just going to be game week 8. So João Pedro will actually just sit in my team. He'll just really need to be playing for me in game week 6 again. So that's actually a huge gap in time between game week 1 and 6. I probably could even move a transfer away. The other idea I have with João Pedro is to maybe think about Eddie Nketiah. So if we see in the Community Shield that someone like Arteta is going to be playing Nketiah once again as the central striker, I can actually simply just go for Nketiah as a bit of a early punt for this Arsenal team, capitalize on the fact that he'll get some really solid minutes as the striker at 5.5, and then simply move away from this draft structure and actually play around a 4-5-1. So that's really the idea of this draft. Chilwell, who's actually coming from the bench, will actually be moved into the team for most game weeks after game week 1, where he actually plays this really, really poor Liverpool fixture, in my opinion, just because I think Liverpool attack is still good, Liverpool defense still quite poor. So therefore, Chilwell comes back into the team, and this draft then becomes a very, very solid, stable 4-5-1. I like the flexibility with Odegaard because I can always downgrade away from Odegaard. And there's no one I really want to push for from Odegaard unless, Son suddenly becomes a magical player because Kane's out and he's on penalties, so on and so forth. But for now, I do see myself just simply downgrading away from Odegaard. And by game week 5, when that time comes, I can just move on to someone like Trippier, who is probably going to be my long-term or medium-term transfer target for the time being. So that's going to be my draft. It's going to field Colwill as well on the bench and Mubama. Mubama can obviously be another 4.5 forward, but the reality with someone like Colwill is I do think he's going to be nailed at left center back. The access to actually have a Chelsea defender at 4.5, given their early fixtures being so good, is insane for me. I mean, I could at times even be playing a back 5. That's how good or how well-rounded I think this draft template looks, even though it actually looks like a very, very risky 4-5-1 at times. The biggest thing, too, is if João Pedro doesn't work out as a gamble, he can simply be moved on to someone like a Morris from Luton Town, or I can just go for, let's say, a 5.0 forward if he appears. Like, let's say Kalajic from Wolves, if he becomes a starter, that can just be my sort of bench player, right, for a 4-5-1 template. And that's kind of why I wanted to field out this interesting looking template at the start of the season, anticipating as well that I'm going to be going for Trippier very, very shortly. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. Please drop a like, drop a subscribe, and also let me know what you think about this draft. Are you sort of low on the forwards as I am, or are you just simply moving to Watkins? Are you looking at Darwin as well? Would love to know.